if that's the stage we're in, then as a builder, what is enduring? What can you build that would have lasting value to a group of people that feels like it can endure the continual change of large language models and feels like it can deliver end user value in a way that partners with end users on that journey so that you're still around at the end of this, right? Because as we know, there are lots and lots of SaaS startups that are founded that get funding from VCs, have short-term revenue spikes, and then sort of fall apart. And we've seen so many of those stories, many from Y Combinator, many outside of Y Combinator. And so as a builder, how do you build something enduring?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Hey everyone, welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Quick reminder to catch us on all the typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. This week we're going to be talking about some of the most recent updates in tech, how we're thinking about building across the emerging AI landscape, and some other things as well. Lakshya, I'm going to kick it to you first. We've been building now for a few months inside the education space. I think all of us on this call are of the same opinion that AI is going to be fundamentally changed, possibly forever, by AI. Would just love to hear from you. What do you think? What do you think AI has already done to education? What do you think it will do? Where do you think various companies, various players may be in this space?
Yeah, so easiest thing to start with, I think, is take a look at OpenAI in the last couple of months. They've had a very significant set of product updates. Every single model provider that's significant has. If you look at OpenAI's LinkedIn or you look at their Twitter, you'll see they've made a lot of action in collaboration with universities, selling their product at like a university level, and just trying to get like general adoption at the student layer, saying, if you go to LinkedIn, like, hey, are you a ChatGPT lover? Do you use ChatGPT in really, really creative ways? Get in touch with us because we want to hear from you. I think anyone, OpenAI included, Anthropic included, all that sort of stuff, recognizes that having a system that can respond to you and react to the things that you're troubled with is going to change education at just a fundamental level, right? Whereas it used to be, I need to find time to read a textbook, parse it the way I need to, make time for office hours, and the world wasn't really at your convenience to learn. It is now hyper available for your convenience. That's changed a lot of things in education, and I'm sure there are many students out there who are very cleverly using stuff in that way. We've been building that space, but before I get into that category, I'd love to let y'all react.
Yeah, Shash, I'm curious. You obviously have children that are at various stages of their educational journey. Or have you seen AI kind of creep into their day-to-day workflow, or not so much?
In terms of education, AI is presently really good at reading and writing. It's a thought partner for some people who are more advanced users, but for the most part, this is an advanced Google search. It's an early document drafter. It is a transformer from one format to another format. That's what people are using AI for kind of a better than Google search answer to a question, a science question, a math question. It's not yet transformative. It has the potential to be transformative. It is not today a transformative tool. It is a nice to have extra power tool. Will it be transformative? And how does it look if it is transformative? It's too early to tell. There are lots of advances. So Lakshya mentioned the models. Let's work through the stack. What is the tech stack in AI? We have NVIDIA chips that go into data centers. Those are critical pieces of the infrastructure. Those require a lot of energy. All of that is going to be enduring. So let's expand the scope of the question to what is enduring and what is not enduring in this space. So that part of the stack, the GPU, the power, the data center is enduring. And as an investor, that's how I think about this space, is that's what's very confidently going to endure. The next layer up, the large language models, these are still formative. This is a nebulous space, and there's still quite a bit of flux and movement. So what have we seen just in the last week? We saw Mistral do better than state of the art for OCR. We saw Sonnet 3.7 code do coding tasks really well. We saw OpenAI launch an entire developer framework to do developer tasks, chat completions, and more. We saw Manus AI, which it appears is a wrapper of Sonnet. Maybe one of you guys can comment on this, but nonetheless, large language model plus operator plus tool calling value, right? There's like actual value there. In terms of that, I'll just kind of jump in. Like, is Manus AI, is this like Sonnet wrapper or what is
It's
this?
100%. I mean, like, the thing is, like, I feel like wrapper is being used as like a denigrating term. I think that's totally fine. It's a shame because for those who aren't aware, Manus AI promises to be this like the LM for everything, and when people hear that, they assume it's a model, or they assume it's some like grand like innovation or like some really proprietary stack. And I believe a lot of the tech sphere was pretty let down when it just turned to be Claude 3.7 calling a bunch of tools.
Yeah.
That's fine though. I think the thing that's a shame for Manus as a company is that all of their files were just able to get like ripped out of the code, and a bunch of open source implementations just popped up copying the thing. So whatever moat they might have had just completely disappeared.
Yeah. Okay, so at this stage of the value chain, above the data center, now in the large language model layer, tons of flux, right? Lots of movement, lots of innovation, still very unclear which ones are the survivors in that space. And Google, by the way, as much energy as Google has put into this, have not made a dent in terms of usage.
Mm-hmm.
Google's basically invisible. Gemini is basically invisible in this large language model space.
Mm-hmm.
So now, the question that you started with is an industry vertical, education, that sits on top of the large language model space. So when we ask the question, what is enduring and what will be lasting value in education? Well, we can't really answer for any vertical until we know more clearly the large language model layer, because all of the vertical apps are going to be entirely built on and dependent on the infrastructure of the large language model.
Yeah, I think the thing that I like, and again, this might be jumping a topic, so I'll save the verbose set of thoughts for later. But like, I think what we're seeing is like ChatGPT is fundamentally a very horizontal tool. And what we're seeing, and this happens in education, this is happening in law, this is happening in healthcare. These big providers are covering so much of the stack that the folks who want to get additional value out of education, the folks who want to get additional value out of law, for the most part, if they're clever enough, can get that value out of the existing tool. The existing horizontal platform is such an open sandbox that if you need a sand castle, you make it yourself on that thing, right? And all of a sudden it's there and present for you. I'm surprised. I mean, like, I would be curious to just double click on the thing you said, Shashi, where you said, like, it hasn't felt transformational yet for education. But I'd say, like, for example, like, even just the ability to, like, ask a question, be like, hey, I'm, like, an art student. I have trouble with Gaussian surfaces in physics E&M. Put it in terminology that I, as an art student, might be able to interpret better, like, make a metaphor out of, that I might be able to follow. That's something you couldn't get anywhere. And that feels, like, gigantic to me in regards to, like, the matter of learning, or even like the vocal assistance for folks who like may not be like prone to reading or prone to engaging with visual media to learn things.
Well, true, and I'll concede that I think what you're suggesting, which is a person inside of a field can accomplish a task, a subtask, faster than they could have without the AI tools that they may not have had, let's say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Well, I will grant you that. In fact, I'll expand your point to say all of software engineering is fundamentally improved by having AI assistance, AI coding. Like all of those things are true. And yet, what have we been able to produce from any of those individual industries for the benefit of the general population that we couldn't have produced or didn't produce beforehand? There still are not those downstream, and therefore this is why we are all better off.
Yeah.
Conclusions from the AI.
I think, speaking from my perspective, the largest shift I've seen is in the speed at which learners are learning. And I don't know exactly when you draw the distinction between non-transformative and transformative, but there certainly is some intersection of early adopters that are using these things in fundamentally new ways. Language translation, we've seen, like Lakshya pointed out, kind of cross-domain translation. I don't really understand the vernacular of this field to help me explain it, that kind of thing. I don't know what the trickle-down effect is through high school, middle school, and so on. I know also these universities, in other words, have been cautious, let's call it thoughtful, if you want to be kind of generous about how they are going to allow people to use AI. But I don't know anybody at Duke or any of the universities that I interact with on a regular basis that isn't using AI many times throughout their day. And much to your point, a lot of them are using ChatGPT, mostly ChatGPT, occasionally Claude, but those are basically the only two, as a horizontal tool, definitively.
Yeah.
But they are using it certainly more than they're using Google anymore. And it's probably beginning to take significant market share compared to like PubMed. And in the sim sciences, that would have been kind of unheard of, but we're certainly starting to see it. And so exactly how much that's translating to better grades or improved performance on things that actually matter, I think time will tell. But we certainly are seeing the kind of early days of adoption, I think.
So if we're in the precursor stage, sorry, Good.
Do your thing. That's all you.
If we are in the let's take that viewpoint, Damon, and say I'll just restate it to say that we're in the precursor stage. If we are in the precursor stage where AI tools are being used by builders, but the outcomes of those things are not yet transformative of society writ large. If that's the stage we're in, then as a builder, what is enduring? What can you build that would have lasting value to a group of people that feels like it can endure the continual change of large language models and feels like it can deliver end user value in a way that partners with end users on that journey so that you're still around at the end of this, right? Because as we know, there are lots and lots of SaaS startups that are founded that get funding from VCs, have short-term revenue spikes, and then sort of fall apart. And we've seen so many of those stories, many from Y Combinator, many outside of Y Combinator. And so as a builder, how do you build something enduring?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think you prefaced earlier correctly in saying that guessing in AI is kind of a fool's errand and that like it's very hard to predict. What I can tell you are kind of macro trends that we're seeing, and kind of it reflects my kind of personal opinion on this as well, is that the harder things that previously felt impossible but not unimaginable are now getting funded. A lot of hard tech, a lot of things that translate to improvements in the real world are getting funded. Maybe it's because people are kind of slightly more bearish on traditional SaaS, and they just don't see that as the opportunity to make revenue in the way that they have in years prior. I don't know. Or if that is building enthusiasm that acceleration in the way people are using these AI systems will lead to real world impact. Again, I think it's too early to say, like you said, but certainly if you can extrapolate from people learning faster, there's going to be a delay. It'll be a lagging indicator of actual real world impact for when those insights, for when that new knowledge materializes in something that people will actually use. And so I do think we're going to see in fact, we already have seen a number of new scientific startups that are trying to use AI tools to create things for the real world, whether that be new drugs or new robots or new spacecraft, whatever it might be.
Mhm.
I think the jury is still very much out on whether or not any of those will be successful. I think it's anyone's guess. I also want to say one more thing that, as you were outlining the tech stack, that I want to call attention to is I don't know that the large language model is going to be the foundation for all of the AI systems that we have. I think for the short term, that's probably a pretty safe bet. But I think for some of these applications, we might need different infrastructure in kind of that quote unquote middle layer, if you want to call it that. So I think you're still going to get, the GPUs and the high powered chips. But I'm not completely convinced that all AI is going to be seeded with a large language model. I still think there's some room, especially down some vertical applications, for that AI to be built on top of different architectures. Maybe not diffusion, that's slower, it's more expensive, but something that, maybe
Are
has
you
a
do you mean
decent.
in the vein of like new architectures that have yet to be discovered, or as in like the traditional AI thing should still take a significant slice of the pie, like neural nets, like traditional recurrent like LM, like not LMs, but like just regressions and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think I don't have a direct answer for you, but I think that
Okay.
if you were making me place a bet, if large language models were going to own 100% of the AI pie, or if they were going to own some value that's less than 100%, I would take the less than. You know what I'm saying?
That's
And
a
meaning
good
like,
bet. That's a
yeah,
very
yeah,
good
of
bet.
course,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
nice.
But I mean, I do think that, as we've seen, these systems are by definition probabilistic, and there's a category of problems where that's best. Neural nets have been around for going on 70 years now. I just don't think we've necessarily squeezed all the metaphorical juice out of the lemon in the architecture that is a large language model. I think that
Mhm.
there's something profound in being able to distill the definition of intelligence in the ability to predict the next word or the next token. And I do think that's a fairly profound insight. I just don't know if it's the only one. I mean,
Large
I
language
just think there's
models
more.
nowadays, large language models, they kind of began with the idea of a monolithic model, but today a large language model has the router inside of the model is such a core component of what is presently considered a large language model. And so much to the extent that Sam Altman's been saying they know they made a mess with naming all these models, and they see going forward actually like maybe not even giving the choice and letting the internal router figure out which model needs to do things using kind of the mixture of experts of models under the hood. So I guess, to the most reductive version of that, I'd say, yeah, the largest model trained is not the universal solution, but I think the present kind of incarnation of what a large language model is fundamentally a router with a bunch of models underneath that, and the subset of expert submodels underneath could include a greater variety of things over time. It's probably very realistic to think that would be the case.
Yeah, I recognize we kind of jumped away from your initial kind of question there, Shashi, which is like, what endures? Very simply.
Yes.
I think it's a really important question. I mean, like we grapple with it all the time too, where it's just, I think what we've seen is speed to build is way faster. That also means that there's just much more saturation in any given like application market in general. And we've seen like 2 to 7 standout companies that have seemed to have established really strong footing, right? But I even like look at like what Perplexity is, and I look at like what they're doing as like making not desperate moves, but they're also trying to like recognizing that the earth is really unstable underneath them and trying to stick a landing wherever they can, right? They opened a fund, they're opening up an API, they're trying to compete with OpenAI on said API, right? And so I think in trying to analyze the question of how to build something that endures, I kind of look at it in 2 ways. One, it is very clear to me that the things that are earning money are super vanilla. Like the things that are earning big SaaS like dollars are fairly vanilla products. It's Glean, it's Harvey. It's these companies that are like, yeah, we know people care about documents. We know they care to chat with them. Just service it in a way that like is a little bit tuned to what my use case is. And they got on that train early enough that those contracts have lasted them and given them enough time to figure out and evolve and scale and raise VC money and keep on adapting to the way things are changing, right? Harvey made a chatbot, they're now making agents, that sort of thing. On the other end of it, there is the whole grand vision and the grand promises of AI, right? That's the agentic things that do your jobs for you. It's the vocal assistants that you can just speak to and stuff gets done behind the scenes. It's the multimodal models that you can speak to and all of a sudden create a video. That's really, really blue ocean right now. It's very, very conceptual and no one's managed to make it connect, right? But I think we're kind of approaching a moment where just like in 2003, LLMs had a lot of problems and a lot of startups were born to solve those problems. I think you're approaching another moment like that where a lot of those things are going to emerge and need attention and need people to creatively design the UI and recognize where value can emerge. Another Perplexity might be born that's vocal first. I don't know. But I think even in that case, you're still going to be dancing for footing because getting competed is just a part of the name of the game. It's no longer I got competed with 1 year later. It's I got competed with within 2 or 3 days.
Let's talk about SaaS. So
Yep.
SaaS is a lot easier to build now, but is it true that the hard part of SaaS is still the hard part of SaaS, which is getting your client, your customer, figuring out their problem deeply, being able to tune your user interface, your pricing, creating conveniences where you can take shortcuts that a large language model, a generic solution would not know to take those shortcuts for. Is SaaS better, easier, faster to build and deliver? And is it any more successful now than it was before the AI coding revolution?
My take is I think SaaS margins don't go to zero, but they go from what used to be like 10 to 100x margins down to like 5 to 10 at best case scenario. Because in a lot of cases, like I know speaking for myself, like I have seen a number of companies where I know their value prop, I know their brand, and I know their reputation, but because they're such old and legacy dinosaurs that aren't able to like match their growth numbers, they don't have the option of competing on price anymore, right? They've had their prices and those are fairly static things. And new SaaS up and comers that say compete on auth for $20 a month are suddenly equally capable to the thing that would have costed me $4,000 a month in a different time, right? And that's just part of the game now. I think that being said, like the distribution's still a hard thing. I think it's still hard in a different way, but you get less value out of the traditional enterprise overall, like grandiose, oh, like my SaaS is going to make me a millionaire gambit. Like I think it has to be much more patient in a way that like almost like a retail business person might be, where you're playing like a pretty steady normal level of growth kind of game rather than like suddenly ratcheting value like month over month.
So is SaaS no longer the VC game, Damon? Because if SaaS can no longer demand, if new SaaS companies can no longer demand the kind of margin or multiple that they used to, are VCs fundamentally less interested in SaaS businesses. And is this really now just kind of the realm? Is this the realm of solo entrepreneurs vibe coding their way to mini SaaS?
I think it's an excellent question. I mean, I think the incentives have never been stronger for people to build themselves. It's easier to write software now than ever before. It's easy to host your own software on a low cost cloud solution than ever before. You don't really even need to worry about the economies of scale where you're, paying a charge to a cloud database and distributing that cost against 5 customers. Most of these entities, especially because they're not massive, can host things relatively cheaply on their own. And speaking from the VC perspective, I think the short answer is yes, in that what used to be the most attractive of categories, which was kind of enterprise SaaS, has lost some of its luster. And I think Lakshay said it well, and it's the trend that we're seeing across industries is that there was a 1,000% markup on these services typically over what the underlying cost structure was for a lot of these businesses. And they could charge them because there just simply wasn't an incentive for the buyer to replace them because it would have cost them more. It doesn't anymore, very simply. I think the one carve out or the one potential exception for that is the system of record. So I still think you're going to see companies like Salesforce and others persist, especially in some sectors. And similarly, not exactly related, Palantir, who does a really good job of giving you kind of the other services, safety, security, compliance, all that stuff in heavily regulated industry. So I think you're going to see it. But I think as far as the early days, kind of whatever you want to call it, the kind of glory days of SaaS, I do think we're away from there. I do. And I do think that we're going to see a larger number of products being offered by a larger number of companies, all at lower price points than what we're traditionally used to seeing. The vibe coding question is actually interesting. I want to riff on that a little bit. Lakshya, I want to kind of throw it back to you.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking personally, vibe coding is the only kind of coding I can do. I mean, like I'm simply not trained nor knowledgeable enough to be able to do
Yeah.
all the other stuff. I can intuit where that eventually might get me in trouble. But for the short
Mm-hmm.
and medium term, it's kind of hard to outline where those significant, landmines, so to speak, might be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think? I mean, can vibe all the way? Does it get us 80% of the way there? What do you think?
Vibe coding takes me almost all the way there generally, to be honest. I say this as someone who my undergrad degree was in low level architecture. It was in I know the way the electrons are moving along the wires in the system and building machines that do jobs off of that. Now I write in terrible broken English with typos all over the place, the cursor little thing, and it prints out product for me is what it does. It's very, very good. I think I put most of the quality of this on Cursor. I said this about using Replit. I'm not a V0 user. I know a lot of people. I'm not going to be a person who pays $500 a month for Devin, but I know of people who have paid for Devin and will use it. And I think vibe coding is very correctly so a thing that is doing well, and it should continue to. Honestly, in the last week, there's this typical solopreneur hacker type on Twitter, Levels.io, whatever he prefers to call himself, that made a game, posted on the browser. His claim to it is that it's entirely coded in AI. And it's you can fly around a plane, you can shoot down balloons, land on islands, all that sort of stuff. And he's making 5-digit MRR. I would expect he's close to 70K at this moment. Mind you, he has a really large social following, so it's basically just ad space on his own feed more so than the game. But he made a full game that runs, can have players, hosts ads in the game, all that sort of stuff, without writing code himself, allegedly. But the thing is, I sit there and I believe that because I know you can get away with that sort of thing with vibe coding. And it's fantastic.
And yet, I feel like to do vibe coding well, you need to have enough technical background. This is what Damon was getting at, and I agree with this. I think you need to have enough technical background to know how to set the guardrails, how to have your own process for vibe coding.
Mm-hmm.
For example, small scale commits and writing PRDs and managing your schema and all these things that you as a purely non-technical person, you wouldn't know to do those things. You wouldn't know how to go about doing those things. Yeah. And I've gotten to bad places with Sonnet so many times on very long agent composer threads where it will I'm way past the context window. I assume because the thing that I did 30 minutes ago way up on my scroll bar, it's now undoing all of that stuff to do some new feature. And so all of these things are there's so much nuance still to vibe code. you can get away with that because you have a technical background. This
Mhm.
Levels IO guy can do it because he has a technical background.
Yeah.
Someone with a non-technical background doesn't know enough to be able to vibe code their way to a 70K MRR game,
Yeah.
right? Purely through non-technical.
Yeah. I think that's the case right now. The thing I'd like point back within like a practical scenario is like, let's say you are an aspirational solopreneur, like you have this merch shop or something you want to host online. The matter of fact is that like I would say like especially like having been someone who worked in enterprise primarily, you're not aware how much startup tooling exists out in the world to make stuff easy. And I think if you're like, especially if you're just doing the typical thing, like let's say you want to make your own like pop-up website to sell clothes or something, right? Like you might go to Squarespace, that's $20, so not that expensive. But imagine a world where like you're competing on something where hosting this might be a really expensive affair. The flow might be for someone like you to go to V0, describe the product you want made. It tries to do as much of it as it humanly can. You take it to Cursor or something similar and add the 1 or 2 to 3 unique features you really need it to have. Trust that over time, the longer term memory, the personalization, like the context management of these systems is just going to get better. Odds are you can cover that in maybe like 2 or 3 days. And if you're lucky, you don't run into a landmine. If you run into a landmine, that's where being technical helps, right? But if you don't, and if the models get better, the likelihood of that happening keeps going down. You bring that up, and maybe if you're lucky, there's a no code tool or something that in perpetuity, instead of you having to talk and look at actual lines of Python or JavaScript, it's now just I drag my blocks around now that my website's configured and I'm happy with it. And now I can run my business and even
There's so
fireworks
much
on the
more.
podcast.
There's so much more that tools like Cursor can do over the next, call it 12 months for us, using kind of best practices of experienced engineers, using kind of longer context windows, using more thinking models. All these things, like they're all going to compound to get closer to what Damon's describing of like non-technical person purely vibe coding their way to a solid end product. But it feels like there's still a gap there where vibe coding works for fairly technical people to save a whole lot of time, but for a non-technical person doesn't really like do enough to get them over that threshold.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of the modern day. It just feels to me that, like, for example, like I've within the last like 2 or 3 weeks, Cursor's updated their app multiple times over. Claude 3.7 came out. That's an implicit upgrade for Cursor. I think we'll just see more and more come down the pipe where like I think the place that me being technical has actually helped so far is that like, hey, I recognize when like structure or syntax is a little bit funny, right? Or if something's going off the rails, I have the experience to know that's off the rails behavior rather than just keep trusting and letting it kind of go down the path it's supposed to. But if the models keep getting better and they keep doing their job and we see reasoning continue to get better and better and better, I think it's a fairly reasonable assumption that in 12 months, like the likelihood that someone can spin up a whole app in Cursor, even if they've never touched code in their life, goes up significantly.
I think that's right. And I think it brings up another point that we've alluded to across this discussion, which is like what is, sustainable, what is valuable beyond that. And it does feel like a lot of the taste making, distribution, marketing, that kind of thing is going to persist. And I know this idea has floated around kind of the Xverse, Twitterverse, that kind of thing. Looks like throwing it to you of the idea of like an AI co-founder, kind of this co-pilot-ish entity that sits alongside you. You're a solopreneur, you're a small team like we are. There's gaps in the skill sets that each individual has, or even each collection of individuals of the team has. I'm curious, what's kind of your outlook on that? Obviously, things like coding is a very specific segment of that, but how, as an example, once you've built the product, even if the product's good, do you get it to people, right? It feels like attention is that kind of final piece that AI really isn't helping with yet, other than maybe you could make the argument, increase the amount of content you can make and therefore you reach people that way. But I'm curious how you're kind of looking at that.
Yeah, if I imagine like the quote unquote like founder of the future in a world where like it is so solopreneur dominated and the incentives are super aligned for someone to be a solo builder and releasing product, the things that are going to be hard is sales, marketing, and just overall like distribution, growth hacking, that sort of thing. That especially if the market keeps on getting super, super, super saturated, you have to have something that makes the thing you're doing unique. That is going to be especially hard to find if everybody can code and anyone can spin up a product without like a second thought, right? And so I think like that's the role of who the founder is in this hypothetical world that we're basically in? And that's a really hard question because I think we're even seeing, like, we've had experiences with this where like cold outbound is really hard because AI slop is everywhere. Cold inbound is a privilege if you happen to be in such a position. So there's a lot that I look at. Like, if I look at what an AI co-founder is, like, I've talked about this internally all the time of like wanting an AI COO because so much of my mental bandwidth goes into things that I know can be trivialized. It's stuff that like I know that some company in some number of years will probably have a solution. Maybe that company is OpenAI. Maybe that company is Anthropic. Maybe it's a startup that figures out how to meld it all together in a way that's super clean for my interfaces, right? But someone will. And I think when that happens, the thing I'd want to keep to myself is, hey, we need to distribute a product and make people recognize that this is a brand that is still unique and has a space in the world, right? Liquid Death is a water company, yet people absolutely love Liquid Death because they figure out something really, really clever. That was the founder. But I'm sure in a hypothetical world where someone's making Liquid Death 2, they are having a co-founder create the bottles or figure out the manufacturing supply chain because that's going to be hypothetically trivialized.
I have a
Yeah, I
little bit
think
of a different take. Sorry, I just want to answer your question, Damon. I have a little bit of a different take, which is that I think the next layer of monoliths, next tech giants, will be the ones that simplify the noise, just like Google did for web. There will be a company that simplifies the noise of agents and acts as the fundamental router in the way that Google was the router for humans to read websites. There will be a router for agents and all of these components of code. And I think the solo entrepreneur of the future will know how to put their tool, their small tool, in the library of tools so that the router can find their tool. And I think the real competition won't be on distribution, it will be on pricing. I think it'll be pricing, efficiency, and that's where the war will be fought. So if you have two systems that can do auth or two systems that can do transactions, they can both be in the library. The router can compare them, and the router will be what you're selling to. You won't be selling to humans, you'll be selling to the router company. And the router company is simplifying the world for the end user. The end user is saying, set up auth on my site. They're not saying set up auth using auth0. They're not saying set up auth using tool ABC. They're saying set up auth. Here's my price. Here's what I care about. Here's my price. And the router company will be the monolith that will take a small piece of the structure, and they will be the one deciding which tool to use. So the entrepreneur, the solo entrepreneur, the small team entrepreneur will be the ones building those little libraries and sticking them on the shelves. And I think this is the vision that Anthropic has with the MCPs, the model context protocols. I think that's where they're trying to go, is by creating the library, the space where lots of teams can build mini tools to put them into the library so that ultimately the router can find the best composition of many, many different tools to put together.
Yeah, I think just expanding on those thoughts, there's some thinking that for forever, the internet has been made for human consumption, and we are now seeing a shift to where the internet is going to be made for model or agent consumption. And similar to how a lot of blogs, a lot of early internet websites were purely organic in the beginning, but then once Google emerged as a dominant search engine, you saw almost everyone clamoring for search engine optimization, right? You basically started making every website so that you were indexable by Google. I think we're going to see a similar paradigm, like the one that you just laid out, in which we're not search engine optimizing anymore, but we are agent search optimizing, or some acronym thereof, where you're right. People aren't going to request to use certain tools. They are going to request to have certain needs fulfilled. And it's going to be incumbent upon the AI system that is helping them to piece together all of the nuts and bolts, so to speak, to make that thing come to life. And so I mean, even in the things that we're thinking about internally, it's how do you prepare for a world in which a human isn't the one deciding to use the tool that you're using, right? I still think a lot of dashboard style tools, I think a lot of applications are still going to be primarily human use. But as far as information gathering, systems recommendations, that kind of thing, that seems to me like it's exactly like you said, going to fall a lot onto agent decision makers on our behalf. In closing here, Lakshya, as we come up on time, I'm curious, setting the stage for that, what are we thinking about entirely? What's our outlook on, how we run a business in this ever-changing landscape? How do we kind of, metaphorically skate towards the puck when we don't know where the puck is going, like you never do, I suppose?
My take, and this is mostly personal, so I'm not going to say we. This is all me speaking. My perspective on things is I love consumer and I'm an engineer. So my attitude is always like distribution is hard and everything should be automated. My whole thing is if it's annoying to me, I want it gone and dusted. And so the way I'm looking at stuff, I think the puck moving so constantly and changing directions all the time, that has been generally pretty unexpected to me in this journey of what is my first startup. And I think in analyzing that, to me, what has proven to continue to be hard is content, personality, getting user love. Some of those things are my job. Some of those things I think that I want systems involved. Will that help with where the puck's going? I don't know. But I think my ultimate outlook is like efficiency and being reactive to the ecosystem and being agile with it is the important thing. I think there are a lot of questions I have still and a lot of things that like strategically maybe don't make sense. I'm sure I'm naive in a lot of ways. That's a lot of what my superpower is, but I want everything automated. And I think with the agentic age, like whether I'm the person building a router or building a thing that I think is important to the router, I do agree that like we are approaching a time where ChatGPT or some equivalent system is like the center point of how people get information. For some reason, if someone says, I need an analytic system, it's going to choose a result. And you have to be really thoughtful about how that result is found.
I think in terms of finding the directionality of a company in this rapidly evolving landscape, the two principles that I believe are enduring. First, from Peter Drucker, be useful. The first thing to do is find a group of people for whom you can be very useful. Part of being useful is in saving time, saving consideration, being convenient, right? So this is kind of alluding to what Lakshya was talking about making annoying things go away. If you're selling convenience, that's something that has sold for a very long time and will continue to sell going forward. So first principle is be useful. And second principle is be reliable. And this is where a lot of AI companies fall apart, is that they're useful 80% of the time or even 90% of the time, but the last 10 or 20%, they completely fall apart and they actually like make the end user's job harder. This is a really hard problem to do in the AI world, is to be reliable and to get incorporated into a larger scale system that needs to just work. Being reliable is super, super important. So I think of those two principles in terms of what will endure. And then just kind of circling all the way back to our conversation earlier, the enterprises that we see that have won, the Harveys of the world in the kind of enterprise AI space, what they've done is found partners who will give them revenue while they co-develop. That formula kind of works. It just works. You build a level of nuance and depth with your customer in a way that is very, very hard for a large language model company to replicate. And so that kind of depth for enterprise works. For consumer, it's exactly what Lakshya was talking about in terms of content, brand recognition, presence. It's all of those things that have to vibe just right with your specific group of people. An AI company is very unlikely to compete with the Nikes of the world, right? Because there's such a deep brand identity there.
Well, excellent. I think that's a great place to leave it. Be useful and be reliable. Thank you all for joining us for this week's episode of the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Reminder to catch us next week on our weekly episode. Find us on all the typical podcast locations and on our YouTube channel. Thank you all and see you next time.